Shadows of the past, light of the future. The clatter of silverware and the hum of casual conversation filled the air, blending with the warm scent of garlic and butter wafting from the kitchen. Claire adjusted her apron, her swollen belly pressing uncomfortably against the fabric. 7 months along and still working 12-hour shifts. She had no choice. Rent was due, and the baby's arrival loomed closer each day. Claire, Table 6 needs their order. And don't forget Table 9's wine, barked Sarah, the restaurant's manager, her voice sharp and urgent. Claire swallowed her exhaustion and grabbed the chilled bottle of champagne from the bar. The label gleamed under the dimmed restaurant lighting, its bold, embossed lettering reminding her that this single bottle cost more than her weekly groceries. It wasn't lost on her that some people could casually sip $500 champagne while she counted quarters for bus fare. As she approached the table, laughter rang out, a sound so familiar it stopped her in her tracks. A voice she hadn't heard in months cut through the chatter. Daniel. Her breath caught as her eyes found him, sitting comfortably in the plush leather booth, a sleek navy suit hugging his tall frame, his signature cocky grin flashing as he leaned toward the woman beside him. The woman, stunning in a red silk dress, laughed, her diamond earrings catching the low candlelight. Claire's grip on the bottle tightened as reality set in. There he was, the man who had vanished from her life, drinking expensive champagne with someone new, acting as though the past year had never happened. She forced herself forward, her steps measured and professional. You can do this. Just another table. Just another customer. The moment she reached them, Daniel's eyes flickered up, his laugh freezing mid-sentence. Recognition flashed in his gaze, followed by something else, something unreadable. Claire? His voice held the barest trace of surprise, but there was no warmth in it. No regret. Just that cool, practiced detachment she had once mistaken for charm. She straightened her spine. Daniel. Her voice was calm, neutral. The woman beside him glanced between them, her brow lifting in curiosity. Oh, you two know each other. Her tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. Daniel didn't hesitate. She's just someone I used to know. Claire's stomach twisted at the words. Just someone I used to know. As if their late-night conversations, the whispered dreams, the promises, none of it had mattered. As if the child growing inside her had never existed. She willed herself to remain professional. With steady hands, she poured the champagne into the woman's crystal flute. The woman, Sophie, as Claire caught from the conversation, smiled in thanks, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Claire. As she turned to leave, Sophie leaned toward Daniel and whispered something, her lips forming words Claire could almost hear. She looks pregnant. Is it? Don't. Daniel cut in sharply, his voice low but firm. Claire didn't wait to hear the rest. She walked away, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Inside the kitchen, she leaned against the counter, forcing slow, steady breaths. The kitchen staff bustled around her, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside her. She had spent months waiting for Daniel to return, to call, to at least check in. Not because she wanted him back. No, that door had closed the moment he walked away. But she had hoped, at the very least, that he would care enough to acknowledge what they had created together. That he would take responsibility. That he would be a man. Instead, he was here, laughing over champagne like she was nothing more than a passing thought. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her mother's name lighting up the screen. Mom, how's work? Don't overdo it. Remember, you have to take care of yourself. For both of you. Her fingers trembled as she typed back a quick, I'm fine. A lie, but one she had perfected over time. Claire, table 4 is waiting. Sarah's voice snapped her back to reality. Squaring her shoulders, she shoved the phone back into her pocket and stepped onto the restaurant floor again, keeping her head high. She wasn't going to let Daniel see her crumble. If he wanted to pretend she didn't exist, fine. But he was wrong about one thing. She was more than just someone he used to know. She was stronger now, and she would prove it, not for him, but for herself and the tiny life growing inside her. Later that night, the city lights blurred as Claire sat on the edge of her small bed, staring at her laptop. She had bookmarked the website weeks ago, a place offering affordable online courses in graphic design. She had hesitated, thinking it was a foolish dream, that it wasn't the right time. You deserve better than this. Sophie's words had stuck with her. A stranger had seen her worth more clearly than the man she once loved. She took a deep breath and clicked the sign-up button. It was time to rewrite her story. Breaking chains, building bridges. Claire's fingers hovered over the laptop keyboard, the soft glow of the screen illuminating the dim apartment. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall. She glanced at the course portal, the welcome message staring back at her in bold font. Welcome to the Beginner's Guide to Graphic Design. She hesitated. Doubts clawed at the edges of her mind. What if I fail? What if this is just another thing I never finish? Her gaze shifted to her belly, her hand instinctively resting on the curve. Samuel kicked gently, a quiet reminder that he was there, that this wasn't just about her anymore. Claire squared her shoulders and clicked the Start Course button. The next morning, exhaustion clung to her like a second skin as she trudged into the restaurant for another shift. Sleep had been elusive, her mind replaying last night's events over and over. The sight of Daniel, his dismissive words, the way Sophie had looked at her. Claire, coffee's up. Benny, the line cook, called from behind the counter. She grabbed the tray and maneuvered her way through the morning rush. The clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversations, and the occasional impatient customer complaint formed the soundtrack of her life. Good morning, Claire. She turned to see Mr. Bernard, the retired architect who had been a regular for years. He sat at his usual corner table, a newspaper folded neatly beside his coffee cup. Morning, Mr. Bernard, she said with a tired smile. He studied her with knowing eyes. You look like you've had one hell of a week. She sighed, placing his omelette in front of him. That obvious. You've got that look. The look of someone carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. He stirred his coffee, his voice softer now. Want to talk about it? Claire hesitated. Mr. Bernard had always been kind to her, always offering little pieces of wisdom in between bites of toast. But she wasn't sure how to put into words the storm inside her. Just life, she said finally, forcing a small smile. He nodded, not pressing her further. Life has a funny way of testing us. But you're strong, Claire. Stronger than you think. She swallowed the lump in her throat. Have you ever thought about doing something else? Something outside of this place? He asked. Her thoughts flashed to the online course she had started last night. Maybe, she admitted. He smiled. Good. You should. You've got that spark, kid. Don't let this place dim it. For the first time in a long time, she believed that maybe he was right. Later that evening, as Claire wiped down the counters after closing, Sophie walked in. Claire stiffened, unsure of what to expect. Sophie approached the bar, glancing around before speaking. Can we talk? Claire crossed her arms. What could we possibly have to talk about? Sophie sighed, setting her clutch on the counter. Look, I know last night was awkward, but I need to ask you something. Claire exhaled, keeping her tone neutral. Go ahead. Is the baby Daniel's? The directness of the question made Claire flinch. She could have lied, but what was the point? Yes. Sophie's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked almost sad. I had a feeling. Claire studied her. Why do you care? Sophie hesitated, then leaned in slightly. Because I think Daniel is in serious trouble. Claire frowned. What kind of trouble? Sophie pulled out her phone and tapped the screen, sliding it across the counter. A set of emails and financial records were pulled up. Numbers, invoices, figures that meant nothing to Claire. What am I looking at? She asked. Sophie sighed. Daniel's been moving money around. Large amounts. Some of it doesn't add up. At first, I thought it was just bad bookkeeping, but now I think it's something more." Claire's stomach twisted. "And why are you telling me this?" Sophie met her eyes. "Because I don't think you realize how much of a mess he's in. And if he goes down, there's a chance he'll try to drag you with him." Claire felt a chill run through her. "I know you have no reason to trust me," Sophie continued, "but I want to help. I can send you these documents. If anything happens, at least you'll have something." Claire didn't know whether to be grateful or suspicious, but something told her Sophie wasn't lying. "Send them to me," she said finally. Sophie nodded and slid her phone back into her purse. "One more thing, Claire." Claire raised an eyebrow. "You deserve better than him." Then Sophie turned and walked away, leaving Claire alone with a storm of thoughts she wasn't sure how to process. That night, as she sat on her bed with her laptop, she checked her email. Sophie had sent everything: records, invoices, emails. Claire skimmed through them, her heart pounding. It was worse than she thought. Daniel wasn't just reckless, he was committing fraud. And if he got caught, he wouldn't just lose his job. He could lose everything. Claire took a deep breath, staring at the documents. She had two choices. She could walk away, pretend she didn't know, let Daniel deal with the consequences of his own actions. Or she could make sure he faced those consequences. Her hand hovered over her phone. She had never been one for revenge. But this wasn't about vengeance. This was about accountability, about protecting herself, about making sure that Daniel didn't get away with everything while she was left to pick up the pieces. With a deep breath, she composed a short, anonymous email. Subject: urgent financial discrepancies. She attached the files Sophie had sent, took one last look, and hit send. The moment the email left her outbox, she exhaled a shaky breath. Whatever happened next, she was ready for it. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was fighting back. Consequences and crossroads. The weight of the email hung over Claire like a storm cloud, dark and heavy. She had done it. She had taken the first real step in ensuring Daniel faced the truth about the mess he had created. But now, she had to wait. The next morning, she dragged herself through another long shift at the restaurant. The exhaustion was no longer just physical, it was emotional. Every time she passed by the bar, she half expected Daniel to walk in, furious and ready to confront her. He didn't. Yet. But something else did happen. Midway through her shift, while balancing a tray of drinks, she noticed a familiar face walking in. Sophie. Claire tensed but kept moving, pretending not to see her. She had already entangled herself enough in Daniel's world. Whatever Sophie wanted now could wait. Except Sophie didn't seem interested in waiting. She caught Claire's eye from across the room and gave her a small nod. Not demanding, not smug. Just acknowledging. As if she knew. Claire ignored it and focused on her work. By the time her shift ended, Sophie was still there, now nursing a glass of wine at the bar. Claire sighed, untied her apron, and approached her. "You're persistent," she muttered, sliding onto the stool beside her. Sophie smirked. "I take that as a compliment." Claire folded her arms. "What do you want?" "I just wanted to check in," Sophie said. "Did you send it?" Claire hesitated but nodded. "Yeah." Sophie let out a slow breath. "Good." They sat in silence for a moment before Sophie spoke again. "I know you don't trust me," she said, swirling the wine in her glass. "But I meant what I said. You deserve better than him." Claire narrowed her eyes. "And you?" Sophie sighed. "I made a mistake getting involved with him. I see that now." She glanced down at her drink, something distant in her eyes. "You ever realize too late that you put your faith in the wrong person?" Claire huffed out a humorless laugh. "Every day." Sophie nodded. "Well, now you get to rewrite the story." Claire wanted to believe that. But something in her gut told her the worst wasn't over yet. The fallout begins. 2 days later, it started. Claire was halfway through folding napkins in the back room when the breaking news alert flashed across the TV mounted above the employee lockers. Real estate exec under investigation for financial misconduct. Her heart stopped. She grabbed the remote and turned up the volume. Sources say the company has launched an internal review following allegations of fraud and embezzlement. Though the name of the individual in question has not been officially released, insiders suggest that top agent Daniel Whitmore is at the center of the investigation. Claire's stomach churned. It was real. The walls were closing in on him. She expected to feel victorious. She had done this. She had set this in motion. But all she felt was uneasy. Because now Daniel would know. And she had no doubt he'd come looking for answers. The confrontation. That night, the inevitable happened. The door to the restaurant swung open with a force that rattled the glass. Daniel stormed inside, his face flushed, his jaw tight, his eyes locked onto Claire like a predator on a hunt. Claire had been stacking plates when she saw him, her whole body going rigid. Stay calm. Sarah, ever the protective manager, was already moving toward them. Sir, if you're not here to eat, this is personal. Daniel snapped, his voice low but full of venom. His eyes never left Claire. And I think Claire knows exactly what it's about. Claire set down the plates and wiped her hands on her apron. She wasn't going to do this in the middle of the restaurant. She nodded toward the back exit. Outside. Daniel didn't hesitate. The moment they stepped into the alley behind the restaurant, the air between them thickened with tension. You think you're clever, Daniel hissed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. Sending that anonymous email. Do you have any idea what you've done? Claire crossed her arms, meeting his glare head-on. I know exactly what I've done. And for once, you don't get to talk your way out of it. His jaw clenched. You ruined me. No, Daniel, she shot back. You ruined yourself. For a moment, he said nothing, just stared at her, his nostrils flaring, his fingers twitching at his sides. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, he said, Was this about revenge? Claire scoffed. If this was about revenge, I would have done it months ago. This was about the truth. Daniel let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You really think this is justice? You think this makes you the good guy? She took a slow breath. I think it makes me free. Something flickered in his eyes, something raw, something almost wounded, and for a brief second, Claire saw it. The man she had once loved, the man who had held her close in the dark, whispered promises of forever, traced his fingers over her stomach in awe when he first found out about the baby. But that man was gone, replaced by someone she no longer recognized. Daniel exhaled sharply and took a step back. You're going to regret this. Claire didn't flinch. No, Daniel. For the first time, I think I won't. He stared at her for another long moment, then turned and walked away, his shadow disappearing into the night. Claire released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had won, but why did it still feel like a loss? Turning the page. Claire sat on her bed that night, Samuel's tiny form curled against her as he slept. She traced gentle circles on his back, her mind replaying the confrontation. You're going to regret this. Maybe she would. Maybe she wouldn't. But either way, she was done being afraid. Her laptop sat open beside her, the course portal glowing softly in the darkness. She clicked on the next lesson, her fingers steady. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something new. And for the first time in a long time, she was ready. Rising from the ashes, the sun had barely risen when Claire sat at her kitchen table, staring at her laptop. The past 48 hours had been a whirlwind of emotions, relief, anxiety, exhaustion. She had done it. She had exposed Daniel, torn the veil off his carefully constructed life of lies. And yet, her stomach churned with unease. She clicked on the next module of her graphic design course, trying to focus. Typography basics. She traced the letters on the screen, willing her mind to absorb the information, but the words blurred together. Her thoughts kept returning to Daniel's last words. "You're going to regret this." A part of her wanted to brush it off as nothing more than a bruised ego lashing out. But another part, the one that had known Daniel intimately, whispered a warning. Daniel didn't like losing, and she had just handed him his biggest loss yet. A soft murmur from the bassinet drew her attention. Samuel stirred, stretching his tiny fingers before settling back into sleep. Claire reached out, smoothing a hand over his delicate curls. "For you," she whispered. "I did this for you." Because no matter what happened next, she refused to let Samuel grow up in a world where Daniel Whitmore got to win. A sudden offer. Later that morning, while wiping down tables at the restaurant, Claire's phone vibrated in her apron pocket. She pulled it out, frowning at the unknown number flashing across the screen. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello. Claire Dawson." Her body tensed. The voice was smooth, professional. A lawyer, maybe? A detective? Someone tied to Daniel's mess? "Yes," she answered cautiously. "This is Ethan Calloway. I'm with Arch and Finch Creative." Claire blinked. The names sounded familiar. "I came across your work through a referral and wanted to reach out personally." Ethan continued. "Your designs caught my attention. I think you have real potential, and I'd love to discuss a freelance opportunity with you." Claire's heart skipped a beat. A referral. Who could have? Sophie, of course. She gripped the cloth in her hand, wiping the same spot on the table even though it was already clean. "I appreciate the call, Mr. Calloway, but I don't have a lot of professional experience." "That's not a problem," he assured her. "Talent is more important. Can we set up a time to talk? Even if it's just a quick conversation." Her pulse raced. This was it. A real opportunity. A door opening where she least expected it. She exhaled slowly. "Okay. When are you available?" The meeting that changed everything. The next day, Claire sat nervously outside the cafe where she had agreed to meet Ethan Calloway. She had borrowed a blazer from her mom, trying to look professional despite the lingering exhaustion in her eyes. She had barely taken a sip of her coffee when a tall, clean-cut man in his mid-30s approached her table. "Claire?" She stood, shaking his hand. "Mr. Calloway." "Ethan," he corrected with a warm smile as he took a seat. "Thanks for meeting me on such short notice." Claire folded her hands in her lap, trying to suppress the nerves bubbling in her stomach. "I have to admit, I was surprised to get your call." "Sophie Parker recommended you," Ethan said, confirming her suspicion. "She showed me some of the branding work you did for her family's winery. It was impressive. Clean, fresh, marketable." Claire flushed, unused to such direct praise. I'm still learning." Ethan nodded. "And that's exactly why I reached out. My firm works with startups and small businesses that need branding and design help. We love working with fresh talent. Your work shows promise, Claire, and I think you'd be a great fit for our freelance team." Her breath caught. "Freelance team?" He smiled. "We offer flexible projects, logo design, social media branding, web layouts. You get paid per project, which means you can work at your own pace while still taking care of your son." Her heart pounded. A real design job. A chance to build something. "What do you think?" Ethan asked, sliding a business card across the table. Claire stared at it, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked it up. She swallowed. "I think I'd love to give it a shot." An unwanted visitor. The high of the meeting lasted until she got home that evening. Then, the knock on her door shattered it. 3 sharp, impatient raps. She froze. No one knocked on her door. Slowly, she approached, heart hammering. She peeked through the peephole. Daniel. A surge of cold dread washed over her. For a moment, she considered not answering, letting him stand there, pounding on the door until he got tired and left. But she knew Daniel. He wasn't the type to leave quietly. Taking a deep breath, she unlatched the lock and opened the door just enough to see him. "What do you want, Daniel?" she asked, voice steady. His face was a mixture of exhaustion and anger. His suit was wrinkled, his normally perfect hair slightly disheveled. He looked like a man barely holding himself together. "We need to talk," he said, pushing against the door. She didn't budge. "No, we don't." His jaw tightened. "Claire, keep your voice down. The baby is sleeping." Something flickered in his eyes, but she didn't let herself dwell on it. "I don't have time for this," she said. "Whatever you came to say, make it quick." Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. "I lost my job." She didn't react. "You already knew that, didn't you?" he accused. "Since you're the reason it happened." Claire's grip on the door tightened. "I didn't make you steal money, Daniel. You did that all on your own." His eyes darkened. "I should have known you'd turn on me." She let out a humorless laugh. "Turn on you? You left, remember? You walked away from your own child." Regret flickered across his face, but it was gone in an instant. "Look," he said, lowering his voice. I need to figure things out. I need time." Claire stared at him. "Why are you telling me this?" He swallowed. "Because I might have to leave for a while. Things are getting messy." Something cold settled in her gut. "Messy," she repeated. Daniel hesitated. "People are digging. If they find more," I cooled. He trailed off, shaking his head. "I just wanted you to hear it from me." Claire clenched her jaw. "And what? You want me to feel sorry for you?" "No," he said. I don't know. Maybe I thought you'd still care." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I did care, Daniel. Once, but I can't afford to anymore." For the first time, he looked genuinely lost, as if he had finally realized how much he had thrown away. He nodded stiffly. "Take care, Claire." And just like that, he turned and walked away. She watched him go, the weight in her chest lifting slightly. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the last time she'd ever have to see him. She closed the door and leaned against it, pressing a hand to her stomach. "You're free now, Claire." And for the first time, she believed it. The storm before the calm. Claire stood frozen against the door long after Daniel had disappeared into the night. The weight of his words clung to her, wrapping around her like an iron chain. Things are getting messy. What did that mean? She exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. She had expected anger from him, maybe even threats, but the resignation in his voice unsettled her more than anything. Shaking herself free from the moment, she turned back toward Samuel's crib. He slept soundly, his tiny chest rising and falling with each soft breath. That was all that mattered. She wouldn't let Daniel's recklessness disrupt the fragile stability she had built. Sophie's warning. The next morning, Claire sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in one hand and her laptop open to her first real freelance project. A simple rebranding job, nothing too complex, but the fact that it was hers made her feel something close to excitement. Then her phone buzzed. "Sophie." Claire hesitated before answering. "Hey, you need to be careful." Sophie's voice was serious, urgent. "Daniel's in deeper than I thought." Claire straightened in her chair. "What do you mean?" There was a pause. Then Sophie said, "I have a friend in legal at his old firm. The company isn't just reviewing his finances anymore. They've escalated the case. Law enforcement is involved." Claire's stomach dropped. "Claire," Sophie continued, her tone softer. "If he gets desperate, he might try to drag you into this. If they find anything that connects you to him financially." Claire clenched her jaw. "There's nothing. We don't share accounts. We don't even talk." "I know," Sophie said, "but that won't stop him from trying to shift the blame. You need to protect yourself." Claire looked over at Samuel, who was babbling in his playpen. She already knew what she had to do. "Thanks for telling me," Claire said. "I'll be careful." After she hung up, she took a deep breath and made a decision. It was time to cut Daniel off for good, closing every door. Claire spent the next few hours combing through everything. Old emails, shared bills, even old texts. Anything that could be misconstrued as financial involvement with Daniel. When she was sure there was nothing that could tie her to his mess, she took the final step. She blocked his number. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she hit the button. A finality settled in her chest. She had spent so much time waiting for him to show up, to be the man she had once believed in. But that man had never really existed. This wasn't just about protecting herself from legal trouble. This was about reclaiming her life. She was done letting Daniel's presence, or the ghost of him, haunt her. A new beginning. Days passed. Then a week. Then two. Each day that Daniel didn't show up, that he didn't call, felt like another step forward. Claire poured herself into her freelance work, designing logos late into the night, absorbing every bit of knowledge she could from her online courses. It was exhausting balancing work, motherhood, and her own self-doubt. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving. She was building. And then something happened that changed everything. The job offer. One crisp autumn morning, Claire received an email from Ethan Calloway. Subject: potential full-time opportunity. Her breath caught as she opened it. Claire, we've been incredibly impressed with your work so far. I wanted to reach out with something more long-term. Would you be open to discussing a permanent position with Arch and Finch? Let me know when you're available to talk. She reread it 3 times, her heart pounding. A permanent position. Claire's hands shook as she reached for her phone. She called Sophie first. Sophie answered on the second ring. Please tell me this is about that email. Claire let out a nervous laugh. How did you know? Because Ethan mentioned he wanted to make you a permanent hire. He thinks you're a natural. Claire exhaled sharply, her mind spinning. I don't know if I'm ready for this. Sophie scoffed. Claire, you took a chance on yourself when no one else did. You are ready. And you deserve this. Claire closed her eyes, absorbing the words. I'm going to do it, she said. And this time, she meant it. The final goodbye. A week later, Claire sat outside the Arch and Finch office, signing her first ever official work contract. She had done it. She was no longer the girl serving champagne to the man who abandoned her. She was a professional, a mother, a woman who had rebuilt herself from the ground up. As she walked back to her apartment, the autumn breeze crisp against her skin, her phone buzzed with a notification. A news alert. Former real estate exec Daniel Whitmore under official investigation for fraud. Claire stared at the screen, unreadable emotions swirling inside her. But no fear, no regret, just peace. She deleted the notification and walked inside, ready to start her new life. A future worth fighting for. Claire had spent so long surviving that she almost didn't know what to do now that she was finally living. The sound of Samuel's laughter filled the apartment as he rolled onto his stomach, kicking his tiny legs in excitement. Claire smiled, adjusting her laptop screen as she sat cross-legged on the floor beside him. She had done it. She had signed the contract. She was officially a designer at Arch and Finch. Her first week had been a whirlwind of onboarding calls, client meetings, and late-night brainstorming sessions. But it felt right. For the first time in years, she was working towards something that belonged to her. She wasn't just the pregnant waitress who had been left behind. She was Claire Dawson, graphic designer. And soon, she would be Claire Dawson, homeowner. She glanced at the small envelope sitting on the coffee table. It was from a real estate agency, a listing for a modest 2-bedroom apartment closer to her new office. Nothing fancy, but it had a balcony and big windows that let in natural light, a place where Samuel could grow up feeling safe. She could afford it now. She ran her fingers over the listing, a slow smile forming on her lips. She was building a life she could be proud of. An unwelcome ghost. The peace didn't last. One evening, just as she was finishing a logo draft, her phone buzzed. A message from a number she didn't recognize. "Claire, it's me. Please don't block this number. We need to talk." She stiffened. Daniel. She had blocked his old number weeks ago, cutting off any chance for him to manipulate his way back into her life. But he was nothing if not persistent. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Ignore him. But something about the message made her pause. She didn't need to talk to him. She didn't owe him anything. But a part of her wanted to know, was this his last desperate attempt? Was he finally realizing that he had lost everything? Before she could overthink it, she typed back, "What do you want, Daniel?" A response came almost immediately. "To see my son." Her grip tightened around the phone. It wasn't the first time he had said this, and every time before, it had been nothing but words. Empty promises. "You don't get to walk away for months, and then demand to be a father," she replied. The dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. "I'm serious this time," she scoffed, shaking her head. "I don't believe you." She was about to shut off her phone when another message came through. "Claire, I'm leaving the city, possibly for good. I need to see him before I go." Her breath caught. Leaving? A part of her had always known this moment was coming. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who stuck around to clean up his mess. He ran. It was who he was. And yet, something in her hesitated. If this really was the last time she'd ever see him, did she want to give him that moment with Samuel? Would Samuel one day ask her about his father? Would he blame her for never giving him the chance to know him? Her chest tightened. She needed to be smart. Setting the terms. Claire agreed to meet him, but on her terms. A public place. 1 hour. Supervised. If he was serious, if he truly wanted to see his son one last time, he'd agree. When she sent the message, she half expected him to push back, to negotiate like he always did. But his response was simple. "Okay. When and where?" The final goodbye. The small park was quiet, the late afternoon sun painting golden streaks across the sky. Claire sat on a bench with Samuel in her lap, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Then she saw him. Daniel stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking different, thinner, tired. Not the polished, confident man she had once known. For the first time, he looked lost. He approached slowly, hesitating before speaking. "Claire." She nodded, keeping her voice even. "Daniel." His eyes flickered to Samuel, who was busy chewing on the sleeve of his tiny sweater. Daniel let out a breath. He got big. Claire didn't respond. She wasn't here to exchange pleasantries. "You have 1 hour," she reminded him. "Make it count." Daniel nodded, lowering himself onto the bench beside them. He didn't try to hold Samuel right away. Instead, he just watched him, taking in every small detail. The way his little hands reached for the zipper on Claire's jacket. The way he babbled to himself like he was having a full conversation. "He's beautiful," Daniel murmured. "He looks like you." Claire swallowed. For a few moments, there was silence. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I messed up, Claire." She turned her head, meeting his gaze. He continued, "I know I don't deserve to ask for anything. I don't deserve to be a father to him. But I just needed to see him. Just once." Something in his voice was raw. Real. She didn't say anything right away. Then finally she whispered, "Why are you leaving?" Daniel exhaled, looking out at the trees. "Because I don't have a choice. There's an investigation. It's only a matter of time before they come for me." Claire had suspected as much, but hearing him admit it felt surreal. "This is the last time we'll see each other," he said. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything." She studied him, searching for the lies, the manipulation. But for the first time, she didn't see any. Just a man who had lost everything. She nodded slowly. "Then this is goodbye, Daniel." His jaw clenched, but he nodded. For the next half hour, He sat with Samuel, talking to him in soft murmurs, tracing his tiny fingers like he was memorizing every detail. And when the time was up, he stood. He looked at Claire one last time. "Take care of him," he said. She nodded. "I will." And then, just like that, Daniel Whitmore walked away. No parting remarks, no last attempts to change her mind. Just silence. Claire watched him go, the weight in her chest shifting. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even relief. It was just closure. And as she looked down at Samuel, who giggled and reached for her face, she realized something. This was their beginning. Daniel was her past, but Samuel was her future. And she was finally ready to embrace it. A future of her own making. Claire stood at the window of her new apartment, cradling a warm cup of tea in her hands. The city stretched out before her, the skyline glowing under the soft light of dawn. It had been 2 weeks since Daniel left. 2 weeks since she had stood in that park and watched him walk away for the last time. She had expected to feel something. Regret, sadness, maybe even guilt. But instead, there was peace. The kind of peace she hadn't known in years. She had spent so much of her life tied to Daniel's chaos, constantly bracing for the next disappointment, the next heartbreak. And now, for the first time, she was free. The air in her apartment was still, save for the soft sound of Samuel stirring in his crib. She smiled, setting down her tea and walking over to him. "Good morning, little man," she whispered, brushing a gentle kiss against his forehead. Samuel yawned, stretching his tiny arms before blinking up at her with those big, curious eyes. Claire exhaled, letting herself absorb the moment. They were okay. They were more than okay. They were starting over. Taking the leap. Claire sat in front of her laptop later that morning, flipping through emails. Her new job at Arch and Finch was going well. She had already completed her first official branding project, and Ethan had emailed her personally to tell her how impressed he was. But there was something else sitting in her inbox. A message from Sophie. Subject: "So, have you thought about it?" Claire sighed, clicking it open. "Claire, I know you're busy adjusting to the new job, but I wanted to check in. Remember how I mentioned my family's business could use a long-term marketing lead? Well, my dad wants to offer you something permanent, not just freelance, something that could really grow into a business for you. No pressure, of course, but I think you'd be amazing at it. Let's talk soon." Claire's heart pounded. It wasn't just a job. It was an opportunity. A chance to build something for herself. She had spent so long working for others, waiting tables, following orders, struggling to make ends meet. Now she had choices. Real choices. She tapped her fingers against the desk, thinking, could she really do it? Then she looked over at Samuel, playing happily on his blanket. Yes, she could. The meeting that changed everything. Sophie greeted her with a hug when she arrived at the winery. "I'm so glad you're here," Sophie said, leading her inside. The Parker family winery was a beautiful rustic estate tucked just outside the city. It had been in Sophie's family for generations, and now they were looking to modernize their brand, expand their online presence, and attract a younger clientele, which is where Claire came in. Mr. Parker, Sophie's father, met them in his office. He was a warm, soft-spoken man with sharp business instincts. "We need someone who understands design and branding," he said. "Someone who isn't afraid to take creative risks. Sophie speaks highly of you, and after seeing your work, I can see why." Claire nodded, still feeling a little overwhelmed. "I appreciate that, but I'm still new to all of this." Mr. Parker smiled. "So is everyone at some point." Sophie leaned forward. "We don't just want a designer, Claire. We want a partner. Someone who can grow with the business, not just work for it." Claire's breath caught. A partner. This wasn't just another job offer. It was a chance to create something real. She thought about the future, about what it would mean to have stability, independence, a career she could truly be proud of. She thought about what kind of example she wanted to set for Samuel. She lifted her chin. I'm in, building the life she deserves. Months passed. Claire poured everything she had into her work at the winery. She developed a full rebranding campaign, designed new product packaging, and built a sleek, modern website to showcase the business. She took risks. She trusted her instincts. And it paid off. Sales went up. Online engagement skyrocketed. The winery started drawing in a whole new crowd, and for the first time in years, the Parker family saw real growth. And Claire, she had never been happier. She was no longer the struggling single mom waiting for life to happen to her. She was making it happen. A full circle moment. One afternoon, she stopped by her old restaurant, the place where she had spent years serving tables, breaking her back for tips. Sarah, her former manager, blinked in surprise when she saw her. Claire, wow, look at you. You look different. Claire laughed. It's been a crazy few months. Sarah eyed her curiously. Are you here for a job? Claire smiled. No, just visiting. She glanced around, feeling an odd sense of nostalgia. She had spent so much of her life in this place, thinking it was all she'd ever have. But now, she had outgrown it, and that was the best feeling in the world. A future of her own. One evening, Claire sat on the balcony of her apartment, watching as the city lights flickered against the night sky. Samuel sat beside her, clapping his hands at the sound of distant traffic. She wrapped her arm around him, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. This is just the beginning, kiddo, she whispered. We're going to do great things. And she believed it. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. And she had built it all on her own. The life she chose. Claire had always imagined that happiness was something she had to earn, something just beyond her reach, something reserved for people who didn't have to fight as hard as she did. But now, standing in the middle of the winery she helped rebrand, watching guests admire the new logo she had designed, she realized something. She was happy. Not in a grand, sweeping, cinematic way, but in the quiet, steady way of someone who had rebuilt her life brick by brick. Her happiness was in the mornings spent playing with Samuel before work. In the way her career was finally something she had chosen, not something she had fallen into out of necessity. In the friendships she had built, not out of convenience, but out of trust. She had spent so long believing that life had already written her story for her, but she had rewritten it. And now, she was living it. An unexpected call. A few weeks later, Claire was working from her home office when her phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't recognize. She debated ignoring it, but something told her to answer. Hello. A pause. Then, Claire. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't heard that voice in months. Daniel. She inhaled slowly, bracing herself. What do you want? Another pause. Then, I saw some photos of Samuel. She frowned. How? Sophie, he admitted. She didn't send them to me directly, but they came up when I was checking something online. Claire exhaled. What do you want, Daniel? She repeated, keeping her voice steady. I don't know, he admitted. I guess I wanted to say that I'm sorry. Again. She waited, but he didn't add anything. No excuses, no empty promises. Just that. She closed her eyes. There had been a time when she would have clung to these words, waiting for them, hoping they meant something. But now, they didn't change anything. I appreciate that, she said simply. Another pause. Then, are you happy, Claire? Her lips parted slightly. She thought about her new career, her apartment, the way Samuel laughed every morning when she tickled his belly. Yes, she said. I am. Daniel exhaled on the other end. Good, he said, his voice almost too quiet to hear. You deserve to be. And then he hung up. Claire stared at the phone for a long moment. Then finally, she put it down. And she didn't look back. The final step. The day Claire signed the final paperwork for her first home, she cried. Not because she was sad, not because she was overwhelmed, but because, for the first time in her life, she had chosen where she was going. The apartment wasn't huge, it wasn't fancy, but it was hers. And when she carried Samuel through the front door, setting him down on the soft carpet of their new living room, she whispered, "This is home, baby." Samuel babbled in response, slapping his hands against the floor. Claire laughed, wiping her tears. This was just the beginning. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't waiting for someone else to save her. She had saved herself, and no one could take that away from her. Epilogue. Full circle. Years later, Claire sat in a bright, sunlit office, her office. The walls were lined with sketches, branding mock-ups, and framed logos from successful businesses she had worked with. Her graphic design firm had grown from a side project into something real, something sustainable. And at the center of it all was Samuel. Now 5 years old, he sat across from her, drawing on a piece of paper with colored pencils. "What are you making?" she asked, smiling. "A sign," he said proudly, holding it up. It was messy and childlike, with big, uneven letters. But Claire recognized the words immediately. Mommy's business. Her throat tightened. She reached out, ruffling his hair. "Think I should put it on the door?" she teased. Samuel grinned. "Yes." Claire laughed, shaking her head. She had been afraid for so long. Afraid of failing. Afraid of falling apart. Afraid of starting over. But she wasn't afraid anymore, because she had built a life worth fighting for. And every single day, she was living it.